Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine stepping onto a steel deck that won't stop shivering beneath your boots. The Pacific dawn, just cracking open, the air sharp with fuel and salt. You're there with Lieutenant Commander Joseph T. O'Callaghan, Catholic chaplain, who has already been awake since 0400, whispering Mass to the early watch in a wardroom lit like a chapel by shadows. Now he stands near the carrier's island, eyes on the ritual of war unfolding below. Ordnance men muscling enormous Tiny Tim rockets toward the Corsair fighters. Can you picture those brutes? 11 feet long, each carrying 500 pounds of high explosive, the kind of punch meant to split a battleship's armor like rotten timber. They have never been fired in combat. Franklin will be the first carrier to hurl them toward the Japanese mainland, and yet, what could Father O'Callaghan not possibly foresee? That in less than 3 hours, this very deck would be a vision of the inferno, a test of men, steel, and luck that mocked every prediction. Because on March 19, 1945, 50 miles off Honshu, USS Franklin would take wounds that naval architects swore would send any flat top to the bottom in minutes. She would lose 807 men in a single instant, more dead than any American warship would ever carry away, and still live to steam. Her flight deck would turn into a holocaust of detonating ammunition and rockets. Her hangar deck would roar like a blast furnace stoked to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And still, she would not sink. How could that be? Against the supposed laws of naval warfare, against the comfortable certainties of material science, she would endure, and the seeds of that survival had been laid into her bones 5 years earlier in a Virginia shipyard, by builders told their bold ideas could never work. What would you have said to them then? The morning itself began with the familiar strain of carrier operations pressed hard against the edge of Japan's home waters. For 3 days, Task Force 58 had hammered at Kyushu and Honshu, softening airfields and defenses for the April 1st invasion of Okinawa. Franklin, assigned to Task Group 58.2 under Rear Admiral Ralph Davison, pushed farther than any American carrier had dared. Think of the map. At 50 miles from the coast, she was well within reach of land-based aircraft, close enough to feel the mainland's breath. Her captain, Leslie E. Jarras, who had taken command in November 1944, kept driving her forward. Some in the crew, half joking and half afraid, called him Custer for his aggressiveness, and they muttered that he was gambling more than he needed to. But tell me, in his place, would you have done differently? The mission demanded proximity. The closer Franklin sailed, the more sorties her pilots could fly, the longer they could loiter over target. That calculus, cold and compelling, set the tempo of the day. At dawn, the first strike leapt free. 12 Corsairs and 16 Avenger torpedo bombers clawed into the sky, bound for airfields around Kobe. The second strike gathered like thunder. On deck, 31 aircraft crouched with engines warming, propellers scything the morning air, while pilots, sealed in their cockpits, walked through final checks, watched the choreography, every motion exact, every risk contained, or so everyone told themselves. Ordnance men had wrangled the experimental Tiny Tims into place beneath wings that looked suddenly too thin for such weight. Gasoline trucks had just finished filling tanks to the brim. Below, the hangar held its own coiled spring. 22 more aircraft, 16 fully fueled, 5 already armed with bombs and rockets for the next cycle. Could there be a more precarious instant in carrier life? Hundreds of tons of gasoline and ordnance exposed across 2 decks at once, the whole ship one breath away from calamity. If a single spark jumped, what then? The clock gave the answer. At 07:07 minutes past 7, a lone Yokosuka D4Y Judy slid out of the clouds at 2,500 feet. Do you see it? One aircraft, a speck against the morning glare, and yet the hinge on which fate would swing. Picture the scene from above. A single speck slips through cloud and confusion while a vast warship hums with routine. Franklin's radar never finds that speck lost in the clutter of American planes cycling home. The combat air patrol, alert but oriented toward other approaches, doesn't see it in time. The anti-aircraft crews, eyes and barrels chasing multiple returns, cannot swing fast enough before the intruder commits. Who was that pilot? We will never know. From the instant he pushed over, he had perhaps 30 seconds, no more, to finish his run. In that half-minute, he loosed 2 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs with lethal precision and disappeared into the cloud bank before a single director could settle on him. He had achieved the dream of every Japanese aviator, a perfect attack on an American carrier. Did he live to tell of it? History offers no answer. The first bomb came down on the center line of the flight deck, 15 feet forward of the island. Imagine the 3 inches of wood planking parting like tissue, the steel below yielding in turn, and then the detonation in the hangar deck. A blast front-moving at 26,000 feet per second punched through the packed aircraft like a giant's fist. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly, a fireball swelling to swallow everything within 50 feet. Then, the elevator number 1, a 4-ton slab of steel 60 by 34 feet, shot out of its shaft as if launched, climbed 400 feet into the air, turned end over end, and crashed back in a storm of shards that scythed through men and machines. Secondary blasts followed in ripples as tanks split and ordnance cooked off. Can you feel the deck buck under your boots? Aft, the second bomb struck among the 31 aircraft warming for launch. It detonated on contact, no delay, no mercy, unleashing an instant holocaust. 31 fuel tanks went one after another, each blossom of flame feeding the next, until a rolling breaker of fire swept across the deck. Men on nearby ships would later swear their own vessels lurched with the shock. Destroyer crews 1,000 yards off were knocked flat by the pressure wave. On Franklin's flight deck, pilots strapped into cockpits fought seconds that were already gone. A few clawed buckles free and hurled themselves overboard. Others burned where they sat, their cries swallowed by the roar of fuel and detonations. What would you have done, sealed in glass and aluminum, with the world turning to flame? The next 30 seconds would decide whether Franklin lived or died. Below, in the hangar where that first bomb had burst, fire raced like a predator. Gasoline from ruptured tanks sheeted across the steel, hunting for a path. It found one, the ventilation ducts. In a heartbeat, vaporized fuel, already burning, was sucked into the ship's lungs and pumped throughout her spaces, the ventilators still running on automatic. Heat began to wake the ready ammunition staged beside the planes. 20-millimeter rounds started to cook off, red tracers flicking through the smoke like malevolent fireflies. 40-millimeter shells went off with grenade-like violence, shredding bulkheads and bodies alike. Men tried to reach hoses, extinguishers, anything only. to be cut down by their own ammunition. And then the Tiny Tims began to light. Consider the dread of that realization. The experimental rockets, 1,300 pounds apiece, were an unknown quantity. In a blaze like this, their solid fuel motors were meant to burn at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 seconds, delivering 50,000 pounds of thrust. At 7:11, 3 minutes after the first strike, the inaugural motor shrieked to life, a sound that rose even above fire and explosions. An 11-foot missile tore away horizontally like a meteor, smashed through the island's 0.5-inch steel plating as if it were foil, and detonated on the starboard side, casting the deck with molten metal and jagged fragments. More followed. Rockets screamed down every axis. Some speared the sea, others punched through bulkheads. One slashed a gun crew in two before bursting in the water. Another vaulted the entire flight deck and vanished over the bow. The flight deck became a killing ground where death arrived by flame, by blast, or by the wild ricocheting fury of weapons designed to tear open enemy ships. What choice would you have had, caught amid that storm? In the midst of it stood Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurica, Jr., the navigator, in his sea cabin just below the bridge when the first bomb hit. A Naval Academy man of the class of 1930, a former intelligence officer from USS Hornet, during the Doolittle raid, he understood at once. The double-thump distinctive, unmistakable, followed by the rolling thunder of secondaries, told him the tale in a single breath. He snatched up his life jacket and battle helmet and sprinted for the bridge. When Lieutenant Commander Stephen Jurica burst onto the open deck, the vision before him etched itself forever into his memory. The after two-thirds of Franklin's flight deck had become a living sea of fire. Planes detonated in savage bursts. Some, their throttles jammed wide, lurched forward like maddened beasts and hurled themselves flaming into the ocean, their propellers howling. The wooden planking of the deck itself blazed, feeding the inferno. Gaping holes yawned where bombs and rockets had punched through, some so wide a man could fall straight into them. All around, figures ran ablaze, rolling desperately, leaping overboard into the dark water. The ship already listed 5 degrees to starboard, and the tilt was growing. Thick black smoke poured upward from the hangar openings, swallowing the after part of the carrier. Every few seconds, another Tiny Tim rocket screamed to life, tearing erratically across the deck in a random, murderous arc. Jurica forced his shock aside. From the stunned survivors, he began to form damage control teams. The forward flight deck was still mostly clear. Perhaps it could be saved if they could cut a fire break, if they could keep the flames from marching forward. The bow section might survive. But aft, the area where 31 aircraft had been spotted for launch was beyond salvation. In that moment, Jurica made one of the most agonizing choices any officer can face. He ordered all men to abandon the after-flight deck. Every effort must be concentrated on saving the forward two-thirds of the ship. It meant leaving wounded men behind, watching fires rage unchecked, accepting that some parts of Franklin were already lost. But it also meant giving what little strength remained a fighting chance to preserve what could still float. What would you have done standing amid that apocalyptic glow? 4 decks below, in the forward engine room, Lieutenant, junior grade Donald Arthur Gary, felt the shock of both bomb hits like hammer blows transmitted through steel. A 1943 Naval Academy graduate aboard Franklin, barely 4 months, he already knew the taste of catastrophe. He had survived the October 30th 1944 kamikaze strike that had killed 56 shipmates. When the double concussion rolled through the hull and the following roar of explosions reached his ears, every man in the engineering space turned to him. Franklin had been racing at 25 knots, her 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers pushing steam into 4 turbines. Now the machinery spaces shook under the violence above. Fuel lines split, steam lines burst, and smoke began to pour through the ventilation system, the same ducts that fed the boilers their air. On most ships, that would have meant a cruel choice: abandon the engine rooms and lose all power, or stay and suffocate. Gary saw a third path. He remembered what the Essex-class designers had built into the ship: deep compartmentalization. The forward engine room could be sealed off entirely. He shouted orders: close every ventilation duct, break out emergency breathing gear. Men strapped on portable air bottles meant for firefighting, breathing from them as they worked. Then Gary began taking stock. Of 8 boilers, 2 still functioned. 3 of 4 turbines could still turn. The electrical system was failing in sections where fire had chewed through cables, but undamaged generators still ran, and Franklin's ring main wiring allowed power to be rerouted around ruined circuits. There, in that inferno of smoke and vibration, Gary made the decision that saved the ship. He would not abandon his post. As long as Franklin had power, she had life pumps to fight fire, blowers for ventilation, steering control, propulsion. A powerless carrier was a corpse. A moving one still had a soul. But the men were choking. The air bottles were nearly empty, the smoke growing thicker. Then memory stirred. Something from engineering school, from the ship's own blueprints. The CO2 system designed to flood fuel compartments during fires might be adapted. If he could isolate the carbon dioxide cylinders and instead connect the high-pressure air bottles from the damage control network, he could flood the engine room with breathable air under positive pressure, forcing the smoke back through sealed vents. It had never been tried. The CO2, if misrouted, would kill them instantly. Yet there was no time for doubt. Half-blinded, gasping, Gary set to work, spinning valves and tracing pipes with trembling hands, turning a fire-extinguishing system into a makeshift life support machine. Around him, men sank to their knees from exhaustion, eyes watering, lungs clawing for air. The hiss of air lines, the clang of wrenches, the deep heartbeat of the engines, these became the rhythm of survival. Picture the needle quivering upward. Finally, he spun the valve and high-pressure air surged into the compartment. The gauge climbed. The dogged hatches held. Smoke began to squeeze outward through hairline gaps around the sealed ventilation dampers. In 2 minutes, no more, the air was thin but breathable. The forward engineering spaces, now sealed and pressurized, became a small, livable island set within a ship otherwise drowning in fire. Up on the hangar deck, Father O'Callaghan had been hurled to the steel by the first blast. 43 years old, a Jesuit, and before the war, a professor of physics and mathematics at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts, he found himself lying in a sheet of burning gasoline. His clothing ignited, he rolled, smothering the flames, and clawed to his feet. Imagine the scene that greeted him. The hangar, a steel box, 6 feet 4 feet long, 70 feet wide, and 17 feet 6 inches high. Its overhead, laced with pipes, cables, and ventilation ducts, was now filled wall to wall with flame and smoke. Aircraft burned hot enough to make their aluminum skins slump and drip like wax. Ammunition detonated without pause, a brutal staccato undercut by the animal shriek of Tiny Tim motors lighting off. The heat grew so fierce that spots on the 2.5-inch special treatment steel plates of the hangar deck began to glow red. O'Callaghan understood exactly what he was witnessing, even though the conclusion felt impossible. The hangar deck was not giving way. Those STS plates, despite temperatures that would have turned mild steel into taffy, were neither warping nor buckling. The inferno, horrific as it was, remained largely trapped at the hangar level. It was not burning through to the third deck below. The steel still held. The ship's bones were intact. Helmet white, marked with a black cross, O'Callaghan moved into the furnace. He bent to the dying, giving last rites with his voice lifted over the roar. Through this holy anointing, may the Lord in his love and mercy help you with the grace of the Holy Spirit. May the Lord who frees you from sin save you and raise you up. Then he turned to the living. Men stood dazed, waiting for direction. He gave it. Form a bucket brigade. Get ammunition over the side before it cooks off. Move the wounded to the forward elevator. Run hoses from the fire main. The hangar sprinklers were shredded by shrapnel, pipes torn and useless, but portable pumps could still draw from the 4 independent fire main systems. Sailors dragged lines toward the blaze, the rubber so hot it burned through their gloves. Others, choking, heaved flaming aircraft to the sea, using tractors to shoulder the wrecks through the 60-foot-wide hangar doors. He walked where souls softened and melted, steady as a lecturer at a blackboard, directing men with the calm authority of a mathematician proving a theorem. In those minutes, he became legend later remembered as a figure out of the Middle Ages, a warrior priest who moved as if fear could not touch him. But O'Callaghan would say afterward that he was afraid every second. What drove him on was a single anchoring realization: the ship was surviving. Despite fires that should have triggered catastrophic structural failure, despite blasts that by all logic should have broken her back, Franklin still floated. If the ship could hold together, then he could hold together. On the bridge, Captain Garris was shaping the command response. 54 years old, he had entered the Navy as an enlisted man during the First World War and risen, step by hard step, to naval aviator and command. One look told him how desperate the hour had become. What would you have done, standing there with a ship half in hell and still somehow refusing to die? All communication lines were gone, burned through. The Combat Information Center lay in ruins, radar screens dying one by one as fire devoured their wiring. The ship leaned harder to starboard, her list nearing 10 degrees. Flames pushed deeper despite desperate hands fighting them, and worst of all, reports from Damage Control Central told a nightmare truth. The fires had reached multiple compartments, from the hangar deck down to the third deck. Franklin was burning from the inside out. Captain Garris faced a decision no commander ever wishes to make. He ordered all non-essential personnel topside, readying the ship for possible abandonment. Hundreds of men poured upward through smoke-choked ladders, some burned, others wounded, many simply terrified. They crowded the forward flight deck and the forecastle as far as they could get from the blaze. Some couldn't bear the heat or the explosions anymore. They leapt into the sea. Others were flung there by blasts. Within 20 minutes of the attack, more than 800 sailors were in the water swimming, clinging to wreckage, praying for rescue. 500 yards off the port beam, the heavy cruiser USS Pittsburgh under Captain John E. Gingrich turned toward the inferno. Gingrich maneuvered his ship between Franklin and the Japanese coast, shielding her and preparing for a tow. By 0730, it had just 22 minutes after the first bomb struck, Pittsburgh had passed a steel towing cable to the crippled carrier and began pulling her away from Japan at 5 knots. Agonizingly slow, yes, but it was movement, and movement meant hope. Then came one of the bravest acts of seamanship recorded in the Pacific War. Captain Harold C. Fitz of the cruiser USS Santa Fe brought his 10,000-ton ship alongside the burning Franklin, starboard to starboard, matching her roll, her drift, her smoke. Fire and explosions tore through the carrier every few seconds. Franklin listed toward Santa Fe, threatening to crush her hull, yet Fitz held position for over an hour. As the two ships ground together, rolling in the swells, men jumped across the gap. Others were lowered on stretchers. Santa Fe's crew heroes in their own right climbed aboard Franklin to carry wounded to safety. By the time she pulled clear at 0900, Santa Fe had rescued 832 men, including 103 wounded. Her hull, once white, was scorched black. Her superstructure dented and blistered from heat, but she had saved 832 lives. By 0800, 2 hours after the bombs, Franklin appeared finished. Dead in the water, save for the lifeline of Pittsburgh's tow, she listed 13 degrees to starboard. From the island aft, she was engulfed in flame and smoke. Ammunition still detonated. Elevators were torn apart. The forward elevator twisted grotesquely across the deck, the aft one gone entirely. Holes gaped through the flight deck, some 20 feet wide. Radio Tokyo had already proclaimed her sunk. Japanese submarines were ordered to find and finish her. Everyone watching believed they were witnessing a death struggle no ship could survive. But below decks, one man refused to surrender her soul. In the forward engine room, Lieutenant Chaplain Donald Gary and his crew, breathing from pressurized air bottles in their sealed, air-charged compartment, had done the impossible. They restored steam to 2 forward boilers. 3 turbines turned again. The jury-rigged electrical system, patched with emergency cables, sent life to key circuits forward. At 0800, Gary lifted a sound-powered phone, the only link left to the bridge. "Bridge, forward engine room," his voice crackled. "I have steam on 2 boilers, 3 turbines operational, can make turns for revolutions equivalent to 2 knots. 2 knots? Barely walking speed. But in that moment, amid a sea of fire and wreckage, 2 knots meant life. It meant that Franklin, against every rule of war and reason, was still alive, still fighting to move. Picture the bridge going silent as the words reach him over the only line still alive. Captain Gearis hears the report and makes the choice that will define the day. He orders Pittsburgh to cast off the tow. Franklin will move under her own power. To the watchers ringed around her on decks, on nearby ships, it looks like madness. A carrier dead in the water, a flame erupting again and again, cannot possibly make way, yet Gearis holds to a single stubborn truth. A ship that can move still has agency. Under tow, she is a victim. Under her own power, she can maneuver, carve wind across her deck to scour smoke and heat, and steady herself through speed and rudder. At 0812, the great bronze screws begin to turn. Power has been brought back to the starboard shafts. Franklin, scarcely making 2 knots, noses away from the Japanese coast. Can you feel the hush among the onlookers? It is one of the strangest, bravest sights in naval history. A carrier that ought to be gone, inching ahead under her own heartbeat. That faint pulse changes everything. Even slow movement breeds wind. The 25-knot airflow built by her motion starts to sweep smoke and heat outward instead of driving them deeper into her lungs. Damage control teams can breathe, can see, can fight. Below, The engineers begin to ease the list by counter-flooding, filling portside compartments deliberately to balance the thousands of tons of firefighting water trapped starboard. Most of all, motion births morale. Men who had braced themselves to abandon ship drift back toward their stations. If Franklin can move, then Franklin can live. Wouldn't you have felt the same tug back toward duty? On deck, Commander Jureka and his damage control parties draw a line they intend to hold. At frame 110, about 400 feet from the bow, they rig a water curtain, every hose they can muster arcing into a solid wall of spray. It's a built-in Essex-class innovation, and it does exactly what it promised on paper. The shimmering barrier soaks up radiant heat, hammers smoke downward, and creates a defensive front the firefighters can anchor behind. Within that watery rampart, the forward flight deck stays largely intact. But the ship is not finished with horror. At 8:45, a secondary blast tears the day apart. A magazine packed with 5-inch ammunition detonates below the hangar deck. The shock is apocalyptic. On screening destroyers, sailors think Franklin has finally gone. A fireball surges 500 feet into the sky, a tower of flame and smoke visible for 20 miles. Dozens of men fighting in that sector are killed. The blast rips a wound through 3 decks hangar down to 3rd. Shards scythe into previously untouched spaces, kindling new fires and cutting down more men. And then the structural miracle repeats itself. The magazine's walls, special treatment steel bulkheads, hold their ground. In a conventionally built ship, mild steel would have torn, the blast would have slashed sideways, and destruction would have cascaded, likely snapping the ship's back. Here, the STS bulkheads, built to resist fragmentation, channel the force upward and outward instead of laterally. Adjacent magazines do not detonate. Fire mains in that section are severed, but redundant mains elsewhere keep pressure alive. The carrier shudders, but her skeleton stays true. By 1,002 hours and 52 minutes after the attack, the balance begins to tip. The fires are corralled, if not conquered. The list, worked by careful counter-flooding, comes back to 9 degrees. In the plant, power climbs, enough for 4 knots, then 6, then 8. By noon, Franklin is making 15 knots. Stop and imagine that transformation. A ship the fleet had watched die is now driving ahead at respectable speed, major fires mostly beaten down, crews reorganizing for recovery. By 1608 hours on, most of the great fires are out. Smoke still boils from the wreckage, and small blazes flare as teams hunt down hidden embers. But the Holocaust has passed. Franklin has endured. The price, though, is almost beyond bearing. By the time the fires had finally quieted and the smoke thinned, the full scale of Franklin's ordeal stood revealed. Naval historians, studying the wreckage and the records, would later count the toll: 807 men killed, most within the first 10 minutes of the attack, and 487 more wounded, many burned so badly that months of recovery lay ahead. Over a third of her crew was dead or maimed, and yet she floated. She moved. She lived. Captain Geary's set his course southeast toward Ulithi Atoll, 2,500 miles away. Escorted by Pittsburgh and a ring of destroyers, Franklin began the long, halting journey home. Her initial speed was 15 knots, but as the engineers coaxed life back into her boilers, she clawed her way to 25. Against all odds, she could make it. The voyage to Ulithi was more than a test of endurance. It was a trial by fire for every principle that shipbuilder Homer Lenoir Ferguson had fought for 5 years before. Franklin was, by every outward sign, a wreck. Her decks holed, her hull scorched, her structure twisted by heat and blast. Yet she stayed afloat because the bones of her design held. The hangar deck, which had endured fires up to 2,000 degrees, showed warping but no buckling. Its steel beams had bowed but not failed. The flight deck, punctured in 53 places, still bore the weight of hoses, pumps, and hundreds of men working to patch her wounds. The hull plating, though strained by the list and the counter-flooding, kept watertight integrity. Most astonishing of all, the underwater protection system built to resist torpedo strikes, but now hammered from within by explosions, remained sealed. Not one critical bulkhead in that system had given way. On March 24th, 6 days after the attack, Franklin limped into Ulithi Lagoon. She was a floating morgue, carrying 807 of her dead, but she had arrived under her own power. For 4 days, sailors patched gaping holes in her decks, sealed ruptures, and made her weather-tight enough for the next leg. On March 28th, she turned east for Pearl Harbor, still capable of 20 knots. When Franklin steamed into Pearl Harbor on April 3, 1945, she stunned all who saw her. Word of her survival had spread, but the sight itself, this shattered, smoke-blackened giant gliding in under her own power defied belief. Temporary repairs were made to ready her for the long haul through the Panama Canal to the Atlantic. On April 10th, she sailed again, bound for the Brooklyn Navy Yard. 18 days later, April 28th, she arrived. At Brooklyn, the Navy's engineers and Bureau of Ships inspectors finally laid bare what the battle had done. War Damage Report number 56, compiled over the following months, read like an autopsy of survival. 40% of the hangar deck obliterated, 53 holes in the flight deck, some 3 feet wide, others 20. Over a third of crew berthing compartments burned to cinders. Steel bulkheads twisted, electrical systems gutted, ventilation destroyed. Thousands of structural members had to be replaced. The cost and time to rebuild would rival that of constructing a new carrier 2 years at least. And yet, when they checked her spine, the surveyors found the keel straight, the hull intact, the main structural frames merely strained, but not broken. Even the engine rooms, blackened, warped, half-choked with ash, were repairable. Franklin could have been rebuilt. The war would end before that could happen, and she never would be. But the fact that she could was extraordinary. The Navy chose a different fate for her. Franklin, the most grievously wounded carrier ever to survive combat, became a laboratory for understanding endurance itself. Instead of rushing to repair her, the Navy opened her up for study. Engineers swarmed through her ruins, measuring, sketching, photographing. They examined how the special treatment steel had held under searing heat, mapping the distortions and stress lines. They traced how blast waves from the magazine explosion had been trapped and redirected by those STS bulkheads. They studied how the independent fire main systems had kept water pressure alive even after half the ship was gutted. Out of that charred hull, they would learn how to build the carriers of the future ships that, like Franklin, could take the unimaginable and live to tell it. All of it, every figure, photograph, scorch mark, and shattered frame was gathered, scrutinized, and poured into a colossal report that would shape every post-war carrier design. Yet Franklin's survival was only one proof of the Essex-class idea. The class kept proving itself again and again in the war's final months. Consider USS Bunker Hill, struck by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, off Okinawa. The damage killed 396 and wounded 264 more. The two hits landed within 30 seconds. The first aircraft smashed into planes being refueled on the flight deck, igniting fires that echoed Franklin's. The second bored into the gallery deck, spreading flames into interior spaces. For 5 hours, Bunker Hill's damage control teams fought the fires and won. She too made port under her own power. Like Franklin, she was so grievously hurt that she never returned to post-war service, but she did not sink. And USS Intrepid? She endured 4 separate kamikaze strikes. Hit on October 29, 1944, repaired and back to sea. Hit again on November 25, 1944, repaired again. A third time on March 18, 1945. A fourth on April 16, 1945. Each blow met the same response. Fight the fires, mend the wounds, return to combat. Intrepid survived the war and served until 1974, finally retiring after 31 years. Today, she rests as a museum in New York City. USS Enterprise, the Big E, became the most bombed, torpedoed, and otherwise battered carrier of World War II to survive hit by bombs at Eastern Solomon, Santa Cruz, and elsewhere, nearly finished by kamikazes in May 1945. Each time, the Essex-class skeleton and the ship's damage control doctrine pulled her back from the brink. She survived the war and served until 1947. USS Hancock, USS Belleau Wood, USS Lexington, USS Wasp, USS Ticonderoga, USS Randolph. Each took serious damage and endured. The constant thread? The Essex blueprint. Extensive special treatment steel, rigorous compartmentalization, redundant firefighting systems, and structural design that made every member carry its share of survival. None of these carriers sank. None was abandoned. All came home. Would you call that luck or engineering made manifest? The contrast with carriers built to other standards was stark and recorded in detail. Pre-war experts often proclaimed that British armored carriers would outlast American designs. In practice, their heavy 3-inch armor plate on the flight deck kept bombs from reaching the hangar. But when fires started below from other causes, those same armored decks and armored hangar sides formed a sealed oven of heat and smoke. Ventilation faltered. Firefighting parties could scarcely function. Damage that an Essex ship could repair in days sidelined British carriers for weeks. HMS Formidable was hit by kamikazes twice in 1945. The armored deck stopped penetration, yet hangar fires from burning gasoline forced withdrawal both times. HMS Illustrious was repeatedly put out of action by damage that, by Essex standards, would have been moderate. HMS Victorious, HMS Indomitable. They faced the same pattern. Tough ships, yes, but their armor philosophy made them less adaptable, more susceptible to mission kill, even when they survived the first blow. What would you rather have in a war of endurance? A fortress that traps its own heat, or a fighter that breathes? As for the Japanese, they began the war with some of the world's finest carriers, but treaty limits and thin combat experience left design gaps. At Midway in June 1942, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were lost to bomb hits. An Essex-class ship would likely have survived. 1,000-pound bombs reached their hangar decks, touching off fuel and ordnance. With inadequate compartmentalization, primitive firefighting compared to American practice, and minimal structural protection, those ships became floating powder magazines. Once the chain of explosions began, nothing could arrest it. By 1945, Japan had no fleet carriers capable of offensive action, while the United States operated 20 Essex-class carriers in the Pacific. Numbers speak with a hard, unsentimental voice, and they vindicate Ferguson's vision. 24 Essex-class ships were completed, 14 saw combat in World War II. They were struck by bombs, torpedoes, and kamikazes 39 times. Damage across the class cost the lives of over 2,600 men. Not one Essex-class carrier sank. Not one was abandoned as a constructive total loss. That wasn't chance. That was design tested in fire, proven at sea. Think of the scoreboard left by fire and steel, every damaged Essex-class carrier repaired and sent back to sea except Franklin and Bunker Hill, which the Navy kept in reserve once the war ended, not for lack of will, but lack of urgency. The class as a whole earned 143 battle stars and carried the fight in every major Pacific campaign from Tarawa to Tokyo Bay. But pause with me. Who dreamed the framework that made this possible? Who shaped the bones of ships that would not die? His name was Homer Lenoir Ferguson, born in Waynesville, North Carolina, on March 6, 1873. At 15, an unusually young age, even then, he entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. He graduated in 1892, reputedly first in his class, though some sources say third. The record is ambiguous. What is certain, he graduated with honors and was tapped at once for further study. Instead of going to sea, he was sent to Glasgow University from 1892 to 1895 to master naval architecture and marine engineering under the Scottish giants, who then led the world. Picture Glasgow in the 1890s, the ringing heart of global shipbuilding. Scottish yards launched the fastest, most advanced vessels afloat. Ferguson studied with men who had drawn the lines of Confederate blockade runners during the American Civil War sleek hulls with iron frames, built to outthink pursuit. He absorbed stress analysis, hydrodynamics, metallurgy, structural design, and something deeper, the Scottish creed that ships must be built first to survive. A ship that sinks, his professors insisted, cannot complete its mission. Burn that into the blueprint. Build ships that live. Ferguson came home in 1895 and began work as a naval constructor, first at Columbian Iron Works in Baltimore, then at Navy Yards in Portland, Oregon, Bremerton, Washington, and Bath, Maine. He supervised battleships and cruisers, discovering the hard difference between lines on paper and rivets in steel. In 1902, he joined Newport News Shipbuilding, then still a relatively small Virginia yard founded by Collis P. Huntington. Starting as assistant superintendent of construction, he made his presence felt. In 1905, at just 32, he resigned his Navy commission to become a full-time civilian at Newport News. By 1914, he was vice president under President Albert Lloyd Hopkins. Then came the shock. On May 7, 1915, Hopkins sailed for England on shipyard business aboard RMS Lusitania. When a German submarine torpedoed the liner off the Irish coast, Hopkins was among the 1,198 lost. The man expected to be his successor suddenly faced the moment. On July 22, 1915, at age 42, Homer Ferguson became president of Newport News Shipbuilding, a post he would hold for 31 years, through World War I, the Depression, and World War II. His stewardship remade the yard into the nation's premier naval builder. Under his direction, Newport News constructed 7 of the 16 battleships in Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909. During World War I, Ferguson drove emergency programs that delivered 25 destroyers to the Navy. He also pioneered human infrastructure. In 1918, worried about worker housing, he partnered with the federal government to build Hilton Village, among America's first planned communities. He formalized the Newport News Apprentice School in 1919, creating a training pipeline that became a national model and still operates today. shaping shipbuilders in the image of craft and rigor. Yet his most consequential work emerged in the late 1930s. With war clouds darkening Europe and Asia, the Navy began sketching a new generation of carriers to supplant the treaty-limited ships of the 1920s. The result would be the Essex class, destined to become the backbone of America's carrier force. Ferguson saw his opening to overturn orthodoxy to fuse Scottish survivability with American scale. He had a radical idea. Imagine rewriting the rulebook with a single, audacious premise. Use armor as structure. For generations, naval architects had treated armor as ballast, with a purpose-heavy protective plating draped over a ship's true skeleton. Armor shielded, it did not carry. Ferguson flipped that dogma on its head. What if, he argued, you built the skeleton out of protection itself? If you employed special treatment steel STS throughout the hull and framing, every plate could do double duty, strength plus protection. What made this possible? STS, developed by Carnegie Steel around 1910, was a nickel-chrome alloy with remarkable qualities. It delivered protective performance comparable to Class B armor plate, shrugging off fragmentation, shell splinters, and bomb shards. Yet, unlike traditional armor, it was ductile enough to be worked like structural steel. You could bend it, weld it, form it into complex shapes. It could take load like a girder and absorb shock like a shield. Most critically, you could use it anywhere strength was needed, knitting protection into the ship's very bones. There was a catch so obvious it might have ended the conversation: cost. STS was far pricier than mild structural steel, on the order of 30% more, depending on thickness and spec. Sheathing a carrier in STS from keel to island would blast the budget past what the Navy wanted to pay. The Bureau of Ships initially said no. Too expensive, too ambitious. Ferguson came back with numbers that felt like heresy. An Essex-class carrier built extensively of STS would actually be lighter than a conventional design of the same strength. Why? Because armor would become structure fewer extra layers, less parasitic weight. Lighter structure meant more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition on the same displacement. And beyond arithmetic, there was survival math. The redundancy from using armor-grade steel everywhere meant that damage crippling a conventional carrier might be contained on an Essex. You won't save money in the yard, Ferguson conceded, but you'll save lives in combat, and you may save the ship. Would you pay more up front to buy back time, blood, and buoyancy later? He wasn't alone. Officers who had dissected the Navy's early losses understood that survivability trumped every other metric. Lexington, lost at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, did not die from the immediate torpedo strikes, but from vapor explosions in wounded fuel systems hours later. Yorktown, also damaged at Coral Sea, had been patched in 48 hours at Pearl Harbor and hurled back into the fight at Midway. She took multiple bomb and torpedo hits, was nearly saved by her crew, and only succumbed to a submarine torpedo while under tow. Better damage control systems and more robust structure, many believed, could have tipped fate the other way. So the Navy approved Ferguson's vision with modifications that made the design even stouter. The hangar deck, upgraded to 2.5 inches of STS from the originally proposed 1.5 inches. The fourth deck, forming the bottom of the hangar box, 1.5 inches of STS. The flight deck would ride on a framework of STS I-beams. Along the waterline, a 4-inch Class B armor belt would be backed by STS. Interior bulkheads throughout the ship would be STS, wherever practicable. And in the underwater protection system, that labyrinth of voids and liquids designed to drink a torpedo's force, the critical holding bulkhead forming the final wall against the sea would be thick STS. In aggregate, each Essex-class carrier would absorb thousands of tons of STS. The exact totals vary by ship and remain fuzzy in unclassified records, but engineering estimates put it around 3,000 to 4,000 tons per hull. The price tag was steep. The payoff was a ship where every structural member leaned into survival. Ferguson didn't stop at metal. He attacked layout with the same survival-first logic. Where traditional carriers favored large open volumes for efficiency, he insisted on the opposite. Divide everything. Let every passageway act as a fire break. Build a honeycomb of extensive compartmentalization, hundreds of distinct spaces, each capable of isolation, flooding, or independent ventilation. The precise compartment count is not spelled out in available sources, but the philosophy is crystalline. Design, so you can lose multiple adjacent compartments and still keep buoyancy and stability. Imagine walking those tight, dogged doors and thinking, if fire takes this bay, the ship still breathes. That was the point. Imagine opening a ship like a set of lungs and giving it more than one windpipe. Traditional carriers trusted a single fire main running the ship's length. Sever that artery, and whole sections went blind and helpless. Ferguson tore up that premise. He designed multiple independent fire mains, each fed by multiple pumps in different machinery spaces, each able to be cross-connected or isolated by a lattice of valves. 9 separate fire pumps, each pushing thousands of gallons per minute, meant if one trunk was cut, water could be rerouted. If a pump failed, others shouldered the load. Overhead, the hangar received a deluge sprinkler system capable of soaking the entire bay. Water curtains could be thrown up to wall off heat and smoke. A CO2 flooding system stood ready to smother fires in fuel stowage. Emergency ventilation could pressurize compartments to keep smoke out or reverse to purge it. Everywhere you looked, damage control was redundant upon redundant, built on the sober assumption that systems would fail, fires would spread, and the ship must survive anyway. What would you build if you assumed the worst was coming? Then the blueprints met steel. The first of the class, USS Essex, CV-9, was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941, Ferguson's yard leading the way. She went from keel to commission in just 20 months, entering service on December 31, 1942. USS Yorktown, CV-10, named to honor the carrier lost at Midway, was laid down at Newport News on December 1, 1941. Her keel went down 6 days before Pearl Harbor, and she commissioned on April 15, 1943, with Captain Joseph J. Clark in command. USS Franklin, CV-13, followed, laid down at Newport News on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor launched on October 14, 1943, sponsored by Lieutenant Commander Mildred H. McAfee, Director of the Waves Women's Naval Reserve, and commissioned on January 31, 1944. None of Ferguson's ideas had yet faced an enemy when those first Essex-class carriers drove into the Pacific in 1943. They were theories, calculations, choices made in drafting rooms and yards a world away from the front. The ships looked formidable. The question was brutal and simple. Would they live? Battle after battle in 1943, 1944, and 1945 answered yes. Where earlier carriers might have gone under to kamikazes, Essexes stayed afloat. When fires stormed through hangars, the damage control architecture worked. When bombs punched through, compartmentalization trapped the chaos. The Essex class became history's most successful carrier design precisely because Homer Ferguson insisted on ships that survive. Ferguson remained president of Newport News Shipbuilding until July 31st, 1946. He retired at 73, having watched his carriers endure every trial combat could invent. Retirement didn't dim his imprint on his community. With Anna Hyatt Huntington and Archer M. Huntington, he helped found the Mariners Museum in Newport News, served on its board, and built collections that preserved the story of shipbuilding and maritime trade. He died on March 14, 1953, a week after his 80th birthday. No Medal of Honor, no Navy Cross, no congressional fanfare, no warship bears his name. The public never learned it. His gift too technical, too abstract, too far from the theater of combat escaped popular notice. But the men who crawled out of Franklin's flames remembered. Decades later, they were still gathering to say so. The first reunion took place in 1947 in New York City, a quiet roll call for a designer whose work had kept them alive. About 200 men came to that first reunion, faces older, bodies slower, but the eyes still bright with recognition. They shared stories that no one else could truly understand. They spoke names of the dead, told jokes born in terror, and marveled that they were still alive. The meetings continued year after year, then every few years as time thinned their ranks. Fewer men, but stronger bonds. In 1995, 50 years after the attack, roughly 80 survivors gathered in Charleston, South Carolina. Together, they walked the decks of the USS Yorktown, a sister Essex-class carrier turned museum. For the first time, they could see clearly what had saved them: the STS bulkheads, the independent fire mains, the labyrinth of compartments that had contained chaos. It was engineering they had never noticed when they served because it had simply worked. By 2005, 60 years on, fewer than 30 survivors met one last time in Norfolk, Virginia, only a few miles from the Newport News Yard where their ship had been born. The shipyard welcomed them back. These men, now in their 80s, walked past the construction bays where nuclear carriers took shape, past computer-aided design stations and robotic welders. The materials were new. The philosophy was not. Build ships that survive. The veterans told the young builders, "We're alive because men like you built our ship right. Build these ships right too. Someday, men you'll never meet will owe you their lives." That was their gospel. Engineering excellence equals human survival. Every man who had walked off Franklin alive owed that chance to choices made years earlier. Decisions about steel thickness, bulkhead placement, fire main routing, and compartment design. The chaplain who fought through fire, the engineer who kept the turbines turning, the navigator who rallied the crew, all were sustained by the ship beneath their feet. Without Ferguson's innovations, their courage would have met only the sea. Franklin would have gone down with not 800, but 2,500 dead. And so the survivors remembered the men who embodied both courage and craft. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan, the ship's chaplain, became the only Navy chaplain ever awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation reads in part, "Lieutenant Commander O'Callaghan courageously led officers and men in fighting the fires and combating the damage. He braved dangerous and burning compartments, areas alive with exploding ammunition and threatened by flames, to lead parties below and save lives. His stout heart, great courage, and cool leadership were the rallying point of the crew." After the war, O'Callaghan returned quietly to teaching mathematics and physics at Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he chaired the physics department and rarely spoke of his medal. He died in 1964, age 62. His memoir, I Was Chaplain on the Franklin, 1956, remains one of the finest first-hand accounts of the ordeal. Lieutenant J.G. Donald Arthur Gary also received the Medal of Honor for his valor in the engine rooms. His citation commended his leadership in forming firefighting parties and re-entering the shattered No. 3 fire room to raise steam in one boiler. His quick action, the citation stated, was of great value in helping to prevent the loss of the vessel. After the war, Gary left the Navy, worked as an engineer for Ohio Edison, and lived an unassuming life. In 1960, a young naval officer wrote him for advice on damage control. Gary replied with both technical detail and wisdom, "Remember that systems don't fail. People fail. If you've designed your systems with enough redundancy, with enough backup, with enough alternative paths, then when people are at their limit, exhausted, terrified, ready to quit, the ship will carry them. Build that kind of ship." He died in 1977, age 56. Commander Stephen Jurixa Jr., the navigator who organized the flight deck firefighting effort, received the Navy Cross. He stayed in the service, eventually retiring as a captain, and devoted his later years to teaching damage control, the art of fighting for a ship's life. He died in 1993, age 83. Their courage was human, their endurance was engineered. Together, they proved Ferguson's belief that a ship's soul is forged not in battle, but in design. Controversy clung to Captain Leslie E. Garris like smoke after a fire. His strict discipline and autocratic style had made him unpopular with many long before the bombs fell. After the attack, accusations followed that he had branded men who went over the side as deserters, even though many had been ordered to abandon ship and others had leapt to escape certain death in flame. A Navy investigation found no wrongdoing, concluding that in the chaos of disaster, communications had failed. Some men genuinely believed the order had been given. Others jumped because it was jump or burn. Garris was promoted to Rear Admiral after the war, yet the dispute shadowed him. He retired in 1946 and died in 1975, largely forgotten outside professional circles. And still, naval historians parsing Franklin's survival noted a hard truth. His decision to keep the ship moving, to refuse to yield, to drive his crew beyond normal limits, was vindicated by the ship's endurance. Without both the engineering to survive and the command will to fight for her life, Franklin would have been lost. Would you have had the steel to make that call? What came after was quieter and, in its way, more tragic. Franklin's post-war fate was inglorious beside her wartime defiance. After she reached Brooklyn in April 1945, she stayed there through the end of the war. Japan surrendered in August 1945 before repairs could even begin. With no immediate need and massive repair costs looming, the Navy set her aside. Franklin was decommissioned on February 17, 1947, and moved to the Reserve Fleet at Bayonne, New Jersey. There she lingered nearly 20 years, a ghost ship slowly surrendering to time. On paper, she changed roles. CVA-13, attack carrier, in 1952, CVS-13, anti-submarine carrier in 1959, AVT-8, aircraft transport in 1961, 1963. But these were paper changes only. Franklin never left the Reserve Fleet. She was too badly hurt, and the price of the extensive modernization needed for post-war service was deemed unjustifiable with newer carriers available. In 1964, she was struck from the Naval Vessel Register. In May 1966, she was sold for scrapping to Peck Iron and Metal Company in Portsmouth, Virginia, for $228,000, only to be repossessed by the Navy in June 1960 for an urgent Bureau of Ships requirement. Her 4 turbo generators were needed elsewhere. Finally, on July 27, 1966, she was sold again, this time to Portsmouth Salvage Company in Chesapeake, Virginia, for scrap. On August 1, 1966, tugs took her in tow for the last time. As she slipped down the channel toward the breakers, a Coast Guard cutter passed and rendered Honor's 3 short blasts of the whistle, the seaman's salute. The cutter's captain, a World War II veteran, later explained himself, "That ship earned honors. I didn't care what orders said. She deserved respect." It was Franklin's last salute. In the months that followed, Franklin was cut apart. Her steel, including the thousands of tons of special treatment steel that had once been her shield and skeleton, was recycled into new construction. According to Navy legend, though not officially confirmed, some of that steel found its way into USS Enterprise, CVN-65, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier commissioned in 1961. Enterprise served 51 years, the longest carrier service life in history, and when she was finally inactivated in 2012, naval historians noted that her survivability features the extensive compartmentalization and redundant systems trace their lineage straight back to the Essex-class design principles. The ship that refused to die had taught the Navy how to build ships that wouldn't need to prove their toughness the way Franklin had. Today, at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C., researchers can open War Damage Report number 56, the official post-mortem of Franklin's wounds and endurance, and read in cold, measured prose how engineering and leadership together wrestled a burning carrier back from the edge. The official War Damage Report number 56 on USS Franklin runs to more than 300 pages of diagrams, photographs, and analysis, and even now, it remains classified as restricted, not because it hides secrets of modern carriers, but because the damage control methods it records are still so effective that the Navy considers them operationally sensitive. Every Navy damage control school studies Franklin's ordeal. Every naval architect shaping a new combat hull studies how her frame held together under the unthinkable. Every carrier officer who plans a strike close to hostile shores knows his confidence rides on that legacy, the faith that his ship, if struck, will live long enough to bring her crew home. Yet the lesson stretches far beyond the sea. In any discipline where lives depend on design, the same principles apply. Plan for the worst, build in redundancy, choose the best materials even when they cost more. Create systems that do not fail catastrophically, but degrade gracefully, giving people time to think, act, and recover. Homer Ferguson applied these ideas to aircraft carriers in 1940, but they hold just as true for airliners, spacecraft, bridges, and earthquake-resistant buildings, for anything human beings entrust their lives to. The attack on Franklin killed 807 men in 30 minutes, a tragedy beyond measure. Yet her survival saved roughly 1,200 more. That ratio, more than 2 lives saved for every life lost, is the purest arithmetic of engineering value. The expensive steel, the extra compartments, the redundant systems, they all demanded time and treasure during construction, but in battle, they bought 1,700 human futures. No ledger can total what those men added to the world afterward. The children they raised, the students they taught, the lives they touched. The ripples of their survival spread across generations, invisible but real. Franklin's story is, at its heart, the tale of an invisible victory, a triumph won not in combat, but before combat, in the drawing offices and shipyards where engineers make the quiet decisions that decide whether men live or die. Those choices lack drama. No one earns a medal for specifying thicker bulkheads. No newsreel celebrates redundant fire mains. Yet these choices matter every bit as much as bravery under fire. Perhaps more, because they make bravery possible. Homer Ferguson never wore decorations, never appeared in wartime newsreels, never stood on a reviewing stand as a hero. His contribution was too technical, too abstract, too far from the smoke and the shouting. But the men of Franklin knew. The 1,700 who walked off that blazing deck alive knew that somewhere in the long chain from concept to keel, someone had insisted on doing it right on thicker steel, extra valves, tighter compartments. Someone had believed human lives were worth the extra cost. And on March 19, 1945, off the coast of Japan, those decisions proved worth more than medals or glory. Because courage without tools is martyrdom. Sacrifice without capability is waste. Heroism without design is tragedy. But when brave men serve aboard well-built ships, when sacrifice is enabled by sound engineering, when heroism is amplified by thoughtful planning, victory becomes possible. Franklin proved that lesson at a terrible price and brought 2,700 witnesses home to testify to its truth. The ship that should not have survived became the ship that proved survival possible, validating every line, every rivet, every decision that shaped her.